So we are like live on YouTube now. I'll share the link and then we start, I think.
Yeah.
I think let's begin. Let people join in as in due course of time. So welcome to all on this important day as we celebrate World's Indigenous Peoples Day with the theme Leaving No One Behind, Indigenous Peoples and the Call for a New Social Contract. We'll dive deep on this subject with our experts later on as to what this social contract is all about. As they say, Indigenous people are at the heart of our civilization. One of them being their contribution in environmental protection. Historically speaking, it was first pronounced by UN General Assembly in December 94, marking the day of the first meeting of UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations on the promotion and protection of human rights in 1982. Across the globe, you name it, and we see them honored at the highest podium of society historically in terms of courage, valor, and service to the society. If history was that good, what has happened in the recent past? Why our eyes are closed to their plight now? Why are we not discussing their social, environmental, climate justice issues as we should have been? The question of distribution of resources, who gets what, when, where, why, and how much has become increasingly difficult to answer. And essentially, that's the crux. Of the approximate 480 million people, majority of these indigenous living across Asia, Africa, and the Pacific region, particularly vulnerable to impacts of climate change. And according to World Bank, some 100 million people would be fighting climate change very soon. Majhuli in Assam is a living example of it, with traditional knowledge base tiled to sculptures, ruins, places of worship have all washed with inundated delta formations happening every passing year. Consequence, migration. And migration is not easy to have. Madhya Pradesh is a glaring example. With no water to irrigate land, the farmer's family is migrating to bigger cities for masonry jobs, which they otherwise are not used to. List goes on. We'll try to dive deep on this subject with experts and see where do we stand and what are the solutions we have that can be taken forward. First, in this luminary panel, I invite Mr. Rituraj Pukan, who is tending to raise voice for environment and climate justice, especially from the Northeast region of ours. A thriving biodiversity hotspot, home to some of the most respected tribes and indigenous people, but unfortunately getting affected by the new development that is taking place. He is founder of Indigenous Peoples Climate Justice Forum, trying to bring stakeholders together on this very important topic. Over to you, Riturajji.
Thank you, Bhavesh. I'll quickly share my screen. Just let me know if it is visible.
Yeah, visible, very much.
Well, first of all, thank you for mentioning Majuli, and it's our pleasure today. Later, we'll have Mr. Jadab Payang, popularly known as the Forest Man of India, joining us, and he will be speaking straight from Majuli district. So we look forward to that. I will quickly share a few insights from a couple of blogs that I published today on the occasion of Indigenous Peoples Day. The first one is Need for Indigenous in Climate Justice Conversations. This is published this journal on the environment society on Medium. And basically, we know that indigenous people around the world, uh, all over the Arctic region, in the Himalayas, all over the Amazon and in across India, they are at the forefront of the climate impacts. And whether it's the mountain communities, the coastal communities, or the riparian communities, they are the most affected. And the plight of indigenous peoples are already very bad because of exploitation by different extractive industries, including mining, logging, and even farming, uh, especially animal agriculture, which is destroying much of the Amazon in this past few decades. So we are in India, we have the world's largest population of indigenous communities outside of the African continent. So there are 705 nationally recognized indigenous communities. Uh, all sorts of impacts are taking place. In the Himalayas, it's the glacial melting. In many other areas, it's the interconnected issues of deforestation and dams that are threatening the lives and lifestyles of indigenous people. In fact, some of these were highlighted in the 2019 Hindu Kush Himalaya Assessment Report. And the worst impacts of all these projections for India are, of course, the indigenous people. Now, the truth even becomes more bitter when one realizes that indigenous communities are among the lowest greenhouse gas emitters in the world. In fact, in places like Bhutan, native people and their communities are net carbon sinkers. If you look at the indigenous people as a whole across the world, uh, they are not emitters, they are rather carbon sinkers, if you can say that for a people. Yet it is really the indigenous who are losing out in the climate battle and who are the most affected. Uh, there are a lot of other communities across India who are affected, not only sorry, I was talking about the riparian communities, Assam, who I wanted to give as an example. As Bhavesh was pointing out, a lot of these communities are actually remarkable for their resilience. The missing community that Mr. Jadapayang belongs to and who inhabit most of the Majuli area are examples of this resilience. They built their houses on stilts to save themselves from the waves of floods. Mr. Payang's house itself was flooded 9 times last year. Compared to that, this year is incredible because we did not have floods till now. So these vagaries of climate change are pretty clear even in these areas. At the same time, many of the riparian communities in Assam has also developed different kinds of food crops which are flood resistant. There are paddy which grows where even though they are submerged in the underwater. So the world can learn a lot from the indigenous people. The second blog I published is by Climate Reality India, and this is of course about biodiversity. And biodiversity is something of very deep interest to me. And in the 2019 Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the IPBES said that about 70% of the world's wild areas and domesticated biodiversity areas are managed, owned, or used by indigenous people and local communities. That means the IPLCs, the indigenous people and local communities, are key for biodiversity conservation. And they hold the key in every serious effort to restore balance to our planet. So when we are talking about the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, when we are talking about the post 2020 framework for biodiversity conservation, it is the indigenous people who are now at the heart of these efforts. So we are going to hear a lot from our experts, but to summarize, like Bhavesh said, today is the International Day of World's Indigenous People, and this was first proposed in 1994, or rather finalized in 1994. It's 2021 now, and these social injustices which prompted the observance of such a day have actually increased. And in fact, unfortunately, indigenous people today have to fight for climate justice as well. I'm going to end with this cartoon I found out today. It's from my friend Rohan, Green Humor, and I think this will set in a good in context the webinar that and the speakers we are going to hear today, because the world has realized that biodiversity and climate, the interconnected crises of biodiversity, climate, as well as water pollution, all of these are very much dependent on how we interact with the indigenous communities, how we use the traditional knowledge, and how we place them at the forefront of the efforts to protect our last remaining wild areas and place nature-based solutions at the forefront of the climate fight. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you so very much for the enlightening words out there, Riturajji. We'll come back to you. With this, I invite Mr. Aditya Pundir, Director Climate Reality India and South Asia, to enlighten us with importance of climate justice for indigenous people, what is happening in South Asia as a whole, where can the forces join hands together, as we have similar issues more or less. Over to you, Aditya.
Thank you, Bhavesh. And thank you, Rituraj, for setting up the tone. And yes, it's a very important day, especially, and it's become even more important today because, as you all know, the IPCC's sixth report has come out today, and it has got a disaster warning for everybody on Earth. Like it says that if we don't change our path, then what we all keep talking about, 1.5 degree and 2 degree, that will be a very reality in the probably another 10 or 15 years. So it's a very damning report. I was since morning I've been reading that report. It's very dense. So probably another webinar for that. So currently I will share my screen, and what I'm going to talk to you today is based on some of my travels across the whole region, whether it's Himalayas, whether it's coastal areas, and what I have met a lot of indigenous people, talked to them, try to understand their problems. So this talk is basically based on that. I'll just share my screen. Can you see my screen now? Okay, so let's start. So since the webinars generally have a lot of mixed audiences, young people, experts. So I'll just take the first minute or so to just bring up that how it all started. Like as we know how the modern development timeline has taken place over the last 10,000 years, the way we have developed. Well, indigenous people were in most of the part of the world to begin with. They were the people who were doing the agriculture. They were the people who were populating the places. And then, of course, the development came, especially in the last 300 years, you can say, once the steam engine was found and we knew how to convert coal and fossil fuels and started building industry around it. So last 300 years the development has been quite severe and has been quite bad for the indigenous people because the areas have been shrinking. And another big reasons for this has been that about 300 years back, we were a few million people, less than 500 million people. And today we are more than 7.8 billion people today. And naturally, so many people more, you require more space. So the forests are being cut. The places where the indigenous people used to stay, their places are being taken away. They are being forced out of their own homes. So all types of these problems are happening today because we have such a huge amount of population pressure. And definitely when you have such a huge population, there's a huge amount of consumption happening. Everybody needs food, everybody needs clothes, everybody needs today, even a cell phone is required by everybody today. So that kind of consumption when we are looking at, and that kind of emissions we are looking at, so naturally it's leading to threat to sustainability, and all our ecosystems today we find are badly stressed. Like this consumption which is going on currently is going on unsustainably. We are not looking at the way the circles can be closed. And this is actually causing a lot of loss to the indigenous people, because it is their places where, as Bhaveshji was talking about, or Riturajji was talking about, it is their places where all the mining is happening. It is their places where all the forests are being cut. And they are the people who are being displaced from the lifestyle which they know. And now the situation is so severe that very soon we will find even we will be displaced. People who are living in cities and people who are living, the climate change is going to see to it that we are also displaced equally badly or equally well, I would say. So probably we are facing one of the biggest threats of the century, which is climate change. Everybody is reading about it and everybody is talking about it. So I will not go deep into it, though I love this subject. But I think now everybody is seeing it's happening. It's happening right in front of you. It's happening higher in the hills. It's happening everywhere. And especially I will focus on in this presentation on two areas where the climate impacts I will discuss, where I have worked and have seen that it's right up in the Himalaya, where a lot of people live who've been living there for centuries and centuries, and the coastal areas. Talking about Himalayas, if you go to Himalayas, the climate change, the temperatures in the Himalayas are rising faster than they're rising in the plains, which is a fact which a lot of people don't know about. Like, for example, we are talking about 1.1 degree or 1.2 degree rise. It's more than 2 degrees at some places in the Himalayas, and even more in some the higher altitudes. So the problem is the glaciers are melting. They're melting fast. And what's happening due to this glacier melt is that you are having landslides like anything, like it has never happened like this in the previous. I was talking to people. They used to have a landslide once in 10 or 15 years. Now, nearly every year, they are expecting a landslide to happen. What time? They don't know. And it can be very bad. The houses can go away. The whole village can get wiped out by these landslides. So these are a big danger than the glacier lake burst. Another problem the village people are facing with the climate change is that the tree lines are moving up. So this is again a living problem. Like the tree line means the pastures they were living on, where they were taking their animals for grazing, they are moving up on the altitude, and so they have to keep moving up. Talking about the coastal region and climate change, well, we've had Amphan, we've had Fani. These cyclones are coming now with such regularity and the intensity, like initially everybody was talking about intensity 3, intensity 2, but now the intensity 4 and 5 is on the plate, where the difference could be a speed of air of more than 180 kilometers per hour. So these are very destructive. They flood the whole place and they can cause a lot of damage, and especially to the people who are living in the coastal region and who do not have the means. Now coming to this hills, I would be talking about indigenous people, how they are being badly affected. As you know, that they are totally dependent on agriculture. Like it's 99% of their income is coming from either raising cattle or surviving on agriculture. And this agriculture is getting very badly disturbed by the climate change in the last few years. Because what is happening now is the snow is not falling. It's more rain which is falling at most of the places. So now this creates a lot of disturbance for these people, because they're used to an agriculture with the base of like, this is where snowfall, it'll melt, they'll plant some seeds. But now it's raining, number one. Number two, the night temperatures have gone up, which is causing another problem as far as crop failures are concerned. And then again, the water has become a crisis for them. They hardly find any water. And this is leading to a lot of, in terms of their, you can say, the way they earn. Second thing I'd like to talk about is the infrastructure. The infrastructure today is being again badly hampered of the indigenous people in the higher hills. Because what is happening is, again, as I said, they had designed their houses for snow. So when snow falls, they have thick walls made of mud so that they can save them from the temperature when it is -10 or -20 outside. But now what is happening is, because of the rain falling, it is washing away their roofs, it is washing away their walls, and suddenly they are finding that the structures which they had lived for centuries are not safe to stay in. So this is again a crisis we are facing. And as I said about the landslides, the number of rainfalls, like the severe rainfalls we are having, this glacier burst we are seeing, the roads are getting wiped away. They are the whole roads, the way they used to access cities, that gets badly broken, and then they take months and months and sometimes years to get repaired. Like I will tell you my example. I visited this 2013 incident which had happened in the Kedarnath when the glacier burst. I visited that place after for 4 or 5 years, I was working on a project for Nanda Devi, and the situation was still the same at the time when the flood came. So the infrastructure takes time to build up back again, and it's a very, very slow process for the people who are living in those high altitudes. The third pressure they are facing is the cultural pressure. The indigenous people are really believing in their beliefs. They have their belief systems, they have a way of life, and that is unfortunately getting threatened today. Like, one of the biggest problems they're facing is migration, because the young people are not getting enough jobs, so they want to migrate, they want to leave their places and go to the plains. And sometimes even the families have to move away. And these people are very religious. They have their kul devis, and they have these kul devtas out there. And the gods do not move with them. They have to move to the cities of Delhi, Mumbai, and all the plains, but the gods are up in the mountains where these traditional people stay. So they feel very insecure. They find it difficult to practice their cultures. They are not even sometimes able to hold their festivals today. And there's a lot of pressure on their marriages, a lot of pressure on how to do small cultural festivals, which were part of their life. Now, suddenly they're finding it very difficult to execute. So these are some of the challenges which now the indigenous people are facing. Now let's go towards the coast. Coastal challenges are more or less similar, what I was talking about hills regarding financial and infrastructure. But another challenge which these people are facing is like with the coming of COVID. COVID was on one side happening, you have these severe cyclones coming. So there's a health emergency happening. There's a physically, you have to move the people out, which needs a lot of effort. Then secondly, the seas are becoming very unruly. Like if you go to places like Sundarban, literally the climate change the sea level has been rising continuously, and the people are losing their farms. I visited a couple of families. Like I was very touched by this woman who was just sitting there, and her whole field had been taken away. There was no field. She was the sole widow surviving on a field, and now suddenly the field is gone, and now she doesn't know how to go ahead with life. So these type of things with the people who have never ventured out of their village in their life, these indigenous people suddenly are finding, today, if I say looking at it's like a challenge for survival. So that is a type of a challenge which we are facing because of this sea level rise. And of course, it is also as I said before, it's again the financial, the agriculture is being lost because of the salt water coming in. They are not able to do things better. They are not able to fish also many times better now. Like they are primarily fishing communities in the coastal region. And now either the big companies have taken away their catch. Climate change is also ensuring that enough fishes are not available. Either they are migrating away and somehow they're not spawning. So all this is leading to smaller and smaller catches. And then finally, the cherry on the cake is that you have these huge cyclones coming and disturbing the complete ecosystem. So all this is leading to a lot of disturbance throughout in our communities, whether it is up in the hills, whether it's down in the coastal region. So what is the way forward? I'm quite sure I'm not going to be able to give you a solution in my 10 minutes talk on what is the way forward. But I think even if we can start working over how can we build resilience, that would be a good strengthening. So from my side, I would say the first thing I would like to suggest is that we have to strengthen the traditional and cultural lifestyle, which has been these people have been enjoying for centuries. And we have absolutely no right of taking it away from them as long as they are happy with it. So I think a more legal protection and more enforcement of the policies, because we do have policies, but unfortunately they are not implemented rightly so that they can benefit the traditional people. So probably if we could have a more robust system where these things could be implemented, that could really lead to a better life for the indigenous people. Then secondly, as I was talking about, climate change is going to have a huge impact on their infrastructure. So I feel that the financial aid for restoring projects, like for example, helping them build their new houses, helping them get their roads back, helping them develop new boats and probably new aids so that they can save themselves from the rising seas, those walls which we have now. So, or getting them projects, because it's difficult to relocate these people. They don't want to lose their land. They don't want to leave their land. So probably we can invest more in financially in seeing that these people have more thing. And I think finally implementing SDG framework, because SDG I think is a very complete framework. It looks after all. It looks after the gender, looks after health, looks after the education, looks after most of the things, justice. everything is looked after. So probably if we are able to assess how these indigenous people are in terms of their SDGs, like for example, whether it's up in the hills or whether again in the coastal area, that will give us a good idea about how to move forward. So thank you very much for listening to me. I think I'm really thankful to all organizers for coming up with this webinar. I think with this new climate report which has come out, I would highly recommend my friends who are here in the webinar to have a look at least at the summary in the various newspaper, and I'm quite sure Rituraj will also going to write a nice analysis, and he writes very well. So I hope we will get a chance to see how he looks at it. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and I hand it over back to you, Bhavesh. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Aditya ji, for that enlightening words, and equally impinging pictures out there. They really take our heart out. What else do we need to understand that climate change is real? Thank you so very much. And now it's my absolute honor to introduce you to all the Forest Man of India, Padma Shri Jadhav Pyang ji, who is setting the gold standard of amalgamation of tradition and modernity. He has single-handedly created a forest that houses elephants, deers, tigers, colony of birds, you name it, and we have it. I hand over the mic to Mr. Rituraj to take this conversation forward. Let's get a taste of the beautiful Assamese language out there with Jadhav ji. Over to you, Rituraj.
Thank you, Bhavesh, and thank you, Aditya ji. Mulaida, আপুনি আহিলে মোৰ লগত মই আপোনাক প্ৰশ্নকেইটা কৰি যাম আৰু আপুনি উত্তৰ দি যাব আৰু মই অনুবাদ কৰি যাম. So we are fortunate to have Mr. Jadhav Pyang, the Forest Man of India. And my first question to him on behalf of the organizers of this webinar is going to be, what are the changes you have seen in your lifetime in terms of a changing climate? So Mulaida, মোৰ প্ৰথম প্ৰশ্নটো হ'ল যে আপুনি আপোনাৰ জীৱনত যোৱা 60 বছৰে, মই জানো আপোনাৰ 60 বছৰ হ'ল, আপুনি তাতে খেতি কৰি আহিছে, তাতে থাকি বসবাস কৰি আহিছে, আপুনি কেনেকুৱা ধৰণৰ জলবায়ু পৰিৱৰ্তন আপুনি নিজ চকুৰে প্ৰত্যক্ষ কৰিছে? আপুনি কোনবিলাক বস্তু দেখিছে যোনটো আপুনি জলবায়ু পৰিৱৰ্তনৰ কাৰণে হৈছে বুলি আপুনি ক'ব পাৰে? Mulaida.
এই ৬২ বছর মধ্যে ইয়াৰ মূলতে হ'ল সংখ্যা বৃদ্ধি, উদ্যোগীকৰণ, নগৰীকৰণ, যান্ত্ৰিকৰণৰ ফলতে সমগ্ৰ বিশ্বলৈ আনিছে দুৰ্যোগ। সেইটো জলবায়ু পৰিৱৰ্তনৰ মূল কাৰণ। দেখা পোৱা যায় যে মই মোৰ হাবিখন মৰুভূমিৰ মাজত সৃষ্টি কৰিলেও ইয়াৰ পৰা কিমান জলবায়ু পৰিৱৰ্তন হৈছে সেইটো মই নিজে অনুভৱ কৰিছো। এতিয়া যিমান দূৰ দেখা পোৱা যায়, পৃথিৱীৰ ছাত্ৰ ছাত্ৰীবোৰ আহে ইয়াত অধ্যয়ন কৰিবলৈ মেচিন লৈ এফুট মাটিলৈ বহুৱাই, তাত প্ৰকৃততে এই গছ গছনিবিলাক আগত নদ নৰ্দমা শুকাই গৈছে। গছবোৰ যেতিয়া ওখ হৈ গ'ল সেইবোৰ এতিয়া নুশুকোৱা হৈ গ'ল। তেতিয়া 100% গছে পানীটো টানি ৰাখিব পাৰে।
Okay. So what Mr. Jadhav Pyang is saying is that he has seen that rapid industrialization even in Assam, in nearby urban areas, and urbanization has led to a lot of changes, and he has himself seen a lot of changes in terms of increased floods and all that. But a lot of researchers, a lot of student researchers from around India as well as abroad have actually come to his forest to study these changes, and these have been documented well in films and research papers. And he requests everybody to look at these publications and reports to find out more about what is happening in his part of the world as well. So I think that's a great answer. And I will ask the next question, and that is going to be, how is the missing community, which Mr. Payang is part of, and other riparian communities coping with these changes? So Mulaida, apnalokor missing manukhini ba ei nodir parot thaka baki jimankhini amar jonojatiyo manukhini ase, এই মানুহখিনিয়ে কেনেকে বানপানী বৃদ্ধি বা যোনবিলাক প্ৰকৃতিত আমাৰ দুৰ্যোগ বেছিকে হৈছে আৰু যিটো জলবায়ু পৰিৱৰ্তনৰ যোনবিলাক এতিয়া পৰিৱৰ্তন দেখিছে সেইবিলাকৰ লগত কেনেকে জীয়াই থাকিব পাৰিছে। ধৰক আমি জানো যে মিচিং মানুহসকলে যোনটো ওখকে ঘৰ বনায় তেনেকুৱা এটা বা বিভিন্ন ধৰণৰ খেতি আছে যোনবিলাক বানপানীত হয়, তো তেনেকুৱা কিবা আপুনি আমাৰ অডিয়েন্সৰ লগত আপুনি হেৰি কৰিব বিচাৰিব নেকি, বুজাব বিচাৰিব নেকি?
যিহেতু মিচিং জনগোষ্ঠীৰ মানুহ সদায় প্ৰকৃতিৰ ওপৰত নিৰ্ভৰশীল, তাত মাত্ৰ তিনিটা বস্তু কিনে, সেইটো কেৰাচিন আৰু মেচটো আৰু নিমখটো, নহ'লে বাকীবোৰ প্ৰকৃতিৰ পৰা লয়। ৰাইচ বিয়েৰ যিটো বনায় সেই প্ৰকৃতিৰ অৱদানে এটা মেডিচাইনে ৰাইচ বিয়েৰৰ যিটো ঔষধ বনায় সেইটোহে হাবি পৰাই লয়। সেইকাৰণে যিমান দেখি পাওঁ মিচিং জনগোষ্ঠী ভৈমুখৰ পৰা সদিয়ালকে অৰুণাচল প্ৰদেশত সদায় নদী মাতৃক ঠাইত থাকে, নদীৰ লগত সম্বন্ধকে প্ৰকৃতিৰ লগত সম্বন্ধ ৰাখে। সেইকাৰণে ইয়াৰ নেচাৰেলি ঘৰ যিবোৰ আছে চাংঘৰ বনাই বানপানী হলে মানে উঠি থাকে, আৰু কোনো কাৰণত মিচিং জনগোষ্ঠী মানে বানপানীত নমৰে, মানে পানীৰ লগত এডজাষ্ট কৰি ল'ব পাৰে। মিচিং ট্ৰাইবে সেইখিনি প্ৰকৃতিৰ ওপৰতে নিৰ্ভৰশীল।
Okay, so he says that many of the riparian communities, including the missing tribe, which he belongs to, are totally dependent on nature. There are only three things they need to buy, and these are kerosene, salt, and the matchbox. Everything else they take from nature. They are by nature, by their traditions and culture, they're protectors of biodiversity, because the rice beer that they are so fond of, and which is intricately related to their culture, needs about 100 plus herbs and shoots and plants to prepare, and almost every household will contribute to the protection or creation of such a biodiversity. So that was his answer. And he said nobody, none of the riparian communities, especially the missings, they will never be affected by floods. You will never hear of any casualties when the flood comes, because these people, they know how to live with the floods. They can survive on a boat, they can survive on the stilt houses, and they can collect their food and other requirements from nature, even during the time of the worst floods that have been seen in the recent years. I would now request Bhavesh or any of the other panelists, if they have any questions, to go ahead with that, so that I can translate it to Mr. Payang.
Very quickly, Neeta Ganguly is asking, what is Jadavji's vision for our future and message for the youth? And she's conveying hello to him.
Mulaida, amare climate reality leader এগৰাকী আছে মুম্বাইৰ পৰা নীতা গাংগুলী বুলি, তেখেতে আপোনাক নমস্কাৰ জনাইছে আৰু আপোনাক সুধিব বিচাৰিছে আপুনি আমাৰ যুৱক চামৰ কাৰণে আপোনাৰ ফালৰ পৰা কি সন্দেহ দিব, কি এটা মেছেজ দিব বিচাৰিছে আজি?
মেইন কথাটো হ'ল যুৱ চামত অকল ভাৰতীয় যুৱ চাম বুলি নহয়, সমগ্ৰ বিশ্বৰ 700 কোটি মানুহৰ যুৱ চামলৈ আগতে তেওঁলোকে জন্মতিথি কেক কাটিছিল, এতিয়া কেকৰ বুলি এজোপা গছ পুলি ৰুব লাগে। তাহাঁতৰ মানে প্ৰেক্টিকেলি সেই গছজোপা ডাঙৰ দীঘল কৰা, তেতিয়া সেই গছজোপাৰ পৰা যিটো অক্সিজেন আৰু বিশ্বৰ নতুন প্ৰজন্মই সেইটো কৰিলে জন্মতিথি ৰুলেই নহব, যিখিনি বন্ধু তেওঁলোকক এজোপাকৈ কৰিব।
Okay, so Mulaida has a very brief message to not just the youth of India, but the youth of the world. He says that everybody should stop cutting cakes for the next few years, and everybody on their birthdays, and everybody should plant a sapling on their birthdays and make it a movement that each and every person, the youth, plants a tree and then earns his oxygen on the planet. And this revolution is going to change the world if all of the youth in the world stops, cutting a cake and starts planting a sapling on their birthdays.
Great message out there. Thank you so very much. And very quickly, our leader Elsie is asking, what are the unfulfilled policies as far as Assam is concerned, which probably Jadavji want to raise voice on? Very quickly.
Mulaida, আমাৰ অসমৰ ক্ষেত্ৰত যদি আপুনি কিছুমান ধৰক চৰকাৰী যোনবিলাক নিয়ম নীতি আছে যোনবিলাকে আমাৰ অসমক ক্ষতি কৰিছে বা যেনেকুৱা ধৰণৰ অসমৰ প্ৰসংগত কিবা কথা আছে নেকি যোনটো আপুনি আজি আমাৰ এই ৰাষ্ট্ৰীয় মৰ্যাদাত উঠাব বিচাৰিছে?
নাই, এতিয়া অসমৰ ক্ষেত্ৰত এইটো গ্ৰহণযোগ্য চৰকাৰে লৈছে আৰু বিশেষকৈ ছাত্ৰ ছাত্ৰী স্কুল কলেজ ইউনিভাৰ্চিটিবিলাকত বেছি সজাগতা হৈছে আৰু এইবোৰ পালন কৰিছে। আগতকৈ এতিয়া অসমত বহুত গছ গছনি বেছি হৈছে। গতিকে মই ভাবো আৰু যিমানবোৰ খালী ঠাই আছে অসমৰতো মাটি নাই, অসমৰ মহাভাৰত ব্ৰহ্মপুত্ৰৰ বুকুত 4/3 মাটি আছে। সেইকাৰণে সেই মাটিবিলাকত ভাৰতীয় ছাত্ৰ ছাত্ৰী ভাৰতীয় এনজিঅ'সকল বা ছাত্ৰ ছাত্ৰীসকল বহুত আমাৰ অক্সিজেনটোৰ অভাৱ ঘটিব আৰু অক্সিজেনৰ অভাৱত আমাৰ মানুহ যিহেতু যে গাঁওবিলাকো নগৰ হ'ব, জনসংখ্যা খালী ঠাইবিলাক আমি ফিল আপ কৰিব লাগে, তেতিয়া সুন্দৰ অসম, সুন্দৰ ভাৰত, সুন্দৰ পৃথিৱীখন গঢ়িবলৈ আমি সমৰ্থ হ'ম। সেউজীকৰণ হ'ব।
So in response to Elsie Gabriel's question, Mr. Payang has replied that well, although Assam's forest cover officially has decreased compared to other states in the last few years, but it has picked up in slowly and because of the consciousness that has spread among the youth. But what we need to do, he says, is that there are not much available spaces around the state, but except for the riverbank on the banks of the Brahmaputra where the sandbars are created, and we also have an erosion problem. So both of these can be actually addressed by engaging the youth and villagers, not only from Assam, but from other parts of India who come to Assam to see the biodiversity, and then start a restoration project that, when everybody is talking about restoration this year, let's start it in Assam. And that is what he wants the government to prioritize.
बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद जाधव जी। हम अभी आपसे दोबारा जुड़ने की कोशिश करेंगे। सभी की तरफ से बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद, बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। And with this, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce youth icon from India, Archana Sorang. She has been selected as one of the 7 members of Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, established by Secretary General of UN as part of UN Youth Strategy. Archana, welcome to this webinar. Take us through your journey and experience so far, and help us understand how can front lines be protected, the traditional knowledge be preserved, and how youth can be motivated to play a bigger role in this fight. Over to you, Archana ji.
Thank you, Bhavesh ji, and thank you entire team for giving me this opportunity. Johar to everyone, and a happy International Day of World Indigenous People. Talking about indigenous communities being frontliners of climate action, I would like to emphasize that indigenous communities are the ones who have been working in terms of climate action or biodiversity conservation, not only as a mere working, but through their way of living and the traditional knowledge and practices since ages. And this relationship with indigenous people have with nature is very intrinsic. Like, for example, if I would like to say about myself, so my name is Archana Soreng. The meaning of my surname Soreng in my Khadiya language, the tribe which I belong, means rock. So similarly, there are indigenous communities who are so intrinsic with nature that nature is a source of identity, and we have that element of nature in our name as well. Like the tribal groups have surnames like Kiro, which means tiger, surnames like Kerketa, which is birds, and then surnames like Kullu, which means tortoise. So I want to say that how indigenous communities are so intrinsic with uh, nature, and how nature for us is a source of our identity, and how we are intrinsically related with nature. And talking about myself, my grandfather has been pioneer of a community led forest protection practices, and he was of the opinion that we need to have sustainable relationship with the forest. If we are not having sustainable relationship with the forest or nature, will not be able to survive, because it is only when we have sustainable relationship with nature we will be able to have a balanced ecosystem. And that is what I feel, that this uh, values or this learnings from my grandfather had been passed on to my father as well, and to our generation. And talking about my father being working as a lecturer of social work, but even though he used to practice medicinal practices of traditional knowledge and practices, he was a specialist in snake bites, which he used to give medicines out of roots and leaves, which I have myself witnessed people getting well and people getting cured. The reason behind saying this is that my father did not have formal education on the indigenous knowledge and practices of medical health practices, but it was transition from the elder generation and from his uncles and father generation. So I would like to emphasize that how the indigenous knowledges are mostly oral history, and mostly in terms of the songs, mostly in terms of our folklores, and how things have been transitioned from our elder generation to younger generation. And then talking about myself, I realized that when I was pursuing my master's in regulatory governance, we had environmental regulation, and wherein while pursuing environmental regulation I realized like concepts like organic farming, concepts like biodiversity conservation, climate action, and how village level forest protection practices have been going on, what is eco-friendly way of living. So I realized that these terminologies and these way of living, or very crucial initiatives or concepts for climate action has been practiced since ages in my communities, in the tribal communities. And which also made me realize that things have been written about indigenous community, that how indigenous communities have been in the front line of forest conservation, how indigenous communities have been taking care of the nature forest through the traditional knowledge and practices. But the sad part was most of the literatures which was written by not by the indigenous communities themselves. And that is what motivated me, that being from an indigenous community and having received received the opportunity of education, I feel it's my important role to highlight these issues and highlight the contribution of the indigenous people on climate action. And that is what led me to connect with the UNFCCC youth constituency, which is Yongo, and then also enable me to reach out to more and more youth networks to bring in the perspective of indigenous people in the climate action. And that is how which led me to being part of UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on climate change. So this is how my journey has been. And also one of the key important factor of starting this journey, or which played an important role in this journey, is when I was in class 10, both of my parents being actively involved in activism of indigenous rights told me that if you really want to contribute back to the communities or the society, it is very important for you to enter into the policy making spaces. And that is what has stayed back till with me till now, and which led me to pursue political science and then masters in regulation, which also I feel that it is how crucial it is that we indigenous people are in the policy making spaces, because it is very important to also emphasize that the laws and policies which are made in terms of whether it is biodiversity conservation or environmental policy or climate action, it is again implemented on the indigenous people. And like Aditya sir was saying, the implementation is happening, the laws and policies are being made for the communities. But it is again, as he rightly said, that it is very important to ensure that the indigenous people are in the integral part of the policy making spaces, which I feel that being the member of UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group, I'm able to do it. And I'm really, really grateful for this opportunity. Talking about my experience about climate actions and my field realities, which I have found out, is one thing which I feel is that developmental projects have been a very, very crucial factors in terms of indigenous rights over the land and forest, is what I would like to emphasize. Because, for example, when there is everyone talks about air pollution in the cities, but no one mostly emphasizes on the air pollution or the land pollution or soil pollution or water pollution, how it has been happening in the rural areas as well. Because one of the most important thing which if we see in the rural areas is one of the is developmental projects or extractive mining projects, which we also are seeing in the global arena of saying that we need not bail out polluting industries. So these extractive developmental projects are also leading to land grabbing, displacement and migration, along with carbon emission, which not only is affecting the climate crisis or contributing to climate crisis also, but impacting the indigenous communities, because their lands are taken away, the forest-based livelihood is snatched away. And also at the same time, if we see then, because of this transition of migration and displacement, the traditional knowledge and practices which I was emphasizing is also not being transitioned. And there is a gap between indigenous people, elders, and the young people. And that is why I feel it is very, very important also to emphasize that when we all are talking about climate action, it should not be only mere kind of coming up in terms of supporting indigenous people and local communities, but it also needs to ensure that how we are addressing extractive developmental projects, because it cannot go hand in hand. If you say you are supporting indigenous people, but also you are not addressing the core issues of land grab, then it is very, very crucial. And that is why I feel one of the very important factors when we are talking about climate action is recognizing the rights of indigenous people over the land, forest, and territories. Because recognizing the rights and over the land and forest and territories makes them more secures the food safety, their livelihood, and their health as well, which in every way, in a holistic way, enables them to continue to contribute towards climate action or continue with the traditional knowledge and practices. For example, if we see about plastic pollution also, how leaf plates made by the indigenous people, the mat which are made by leaves of the indigenous people, the forest food which is being haved by the indigenous people, these are also very much alternatives to plastic pollution. If we see, like the leaf plates is majorly can be seen as a good alternative for the cutleries, for the plastic cutlery. So I feel these items which are being also made, or the articles which are made by the indigenous community, for example chairs, mat, leaf plate cutleries, also needs to be promoted and supported. And that is why I feel when we all are talking about COVID-19 green recovery, and when we all are talking about a just transition, it is also very important that in terms of green jobs, we also support the indigenous people in terms of the forest-based livelihood and their entrepreneurship skills also. And the third thing which I would like to say and would like to sum up is that taking indigenous people's free, prior and informed consent is very, very important. I would like to share a small example about how laws and policies turns out to be problematic. Is like, we all have been seeing that how there has been a lot of plantation policies going on in the global arena, and we also see many a times this plantation drives are also depriving the indigenous people from their land, because these in order to plant more artificial forest, or in order to plant more trees, it is also seen that how indigenous people are also displaced. But this example which I would like to say is basically in terms of the free, prior and informed consent, is that when I had visited one of my community members in Odisha, in Mayurbhanj district, so the community said that a lot of people had come in their area and were forcing them for the plantation. So I said, what were the plants they brought in? So they said they brought in fruit trees like mango trees and jackfruit trees. So I was like, what is the problem in the fruit trees and mango trees and jackfruit trees to be planted in your village areas as a plantation? So then the community members said that if fruit trees like jackfruit trees and mango trees are planted in the periphery of the area, wild boars, elephants, and monkeys will and boars will come and eat those fruits and also destroy agriculture areas. So I felt this is a very eye-opening was an eye-opening learning and experience for me, is that how few implementation of policies are also tend out to be contradictory if the local communities are not taken, or their voices are not taken into consideration. So that is what then the community leader was saying, that we wanted trees like sal tree, because that would be really helpful for us, and also that would be really helpful for the ecosystem there. So that is why I also feel the free, prior and informed consent of indigenous people while implementation is very, very important of laws and policies. Not only free, prior informed consent, but it is very important to ensure their participation in across the policy making spheres. The last and the at the end, I would like to say that when we are talking about youth in terms of climate action, we see that youths have been really, really vocal about climate action and demanding for climate action. But one of the major challenges which we are facing is that we still, as a young people, are not feeling safe, and therefore it is very important that there is safe and enabling spaces for young people to share their voices, because we have seen how there has been gross human rights violation and curbing of voices of the young people across the globe. So I seek your support, and I would like to appeal all the members, those who are here, as in on this Indigenous Day, I feel it is very important that we as an indigenous communities are willing to work together with you for climate action. Let us work together and with respect to each other in solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Archana ji, for these enlightening words. I'm pretty sure that the youth joining out here have taken notes as to how to move forward in this direction. Your words provide wisdom. Thank you so very much. And with this, I invite epitome of knowledge, a person who has dedicated his entire life for the cause of environmental protection and its upliftment, the main force behind Ramsar sites in India, a catalyst for multilateral and bilateral knowledge exchange from the world to India and vice versa. Dr. Rambhuj, CEO Mobius Foundation, please help us understand how we be sure of leaving no one behind, how these indigenous knowledge systems be built upon, their importance and present day context. Over to you, Rambhuji.
Thank you, Bhavesh. Thank you so much for such a great introduction, I would say, though I do not deserve all those accolades that you just said. In fact, I have been involved in this with the UN system for a very long period, almost 2 decades, I would say. But I began my career working in Northeast. That was the area, I would say, where I spent continuously 5 years while I was doing first my PhD and then with Northeastern Hill University. and extensively worked with the communities there, particularly the local indigenous communities. I would like to just share my presentation as well, so that it becomes easy to navigate. Yes. So, of course, this is what we all are observing today, the International Day of the World's Indigenous People. And the theme is Leaving No One Behind, Indigenous Peoples and Call for a New Social Contract. I think theme is very apt, and it's directly linked to the Sustainable Development Goal for which every country is committed to. As I was telling, the context to me is a very, because I have been involved in this, the local traditional knowledge, the indigenous people, during my PhD days way back in 80s, and also followed by many publications that we did together with a group, Professor Ramakrishnan, and a group of almost 36 of his co-workers, students, researchers. And one of the publications that we did together was One Sun, Two Worlds, an Ecological Journey. And this is very interesting book published by Oxford University Press. This is basically a dialogue between formal knowledge, whatever we learn through the formal system, and traditional knowledge system. The knowledge which indigenous and traditional people hold, plus what we have this formal knowledge. Some very interesting work. Of course, we also had this sacred groups and shifting agriculture. You can see there the Conserving the Sacred. This was one of the publications that this group brought together. And later on, when I was UNESCO, we continued working in Northeast India on cultural landscapes and how these landscapes, they are shaped by the indigenous people through their traditional knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, as well as how conservation of biodiversity is happening through these initiatives. And of course, one of the major initiatives that UN system is doing is through the UNESCO designation of World Heritage Sites as well as biosphere reserves. And we have 2 World Heritage Sites and almost 5 biosphere reserves in Northeast India. And of late, I was involved with the UNEP on a transboundary project between India, Bhutan, and Nepal. So all these experiences, plus UNESCO's Links program, I think you all, those who are associated with indigenous people, they know about the local and indigenous knowledge systems. Very interesting program. And this feeds into the IPCC, UNFCCC, the disaster risk reduction, this international program, and of course SDGs, very interesting program. Science, both the formal knowledge system as well as the traditional knowledge system, how these gets linked through this initiative. Adit in very beginning mentioned about this, the Code Red for Humanity, this climate change report which has been released. Today's day is, I think, very, very auspicious that way, because this report, which is 6th assessment report, was released today. And this is largest ever with inputs from over 14,000 scientific papers. And the first after 2013, almost after 8 years, this report has come. And UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres rightly said that this is Code Red for Humanity, a warning, because planet has already reached 1.2 degrees warming. And if we consider all the national pledges in terms of intended nationally determined contributions, what we call as NDCs, even then we lead to a pathway to a 2.4 degrees, just double. So more and fiercer heat waves and droughts will come in some regions. These impacts will be most devastating to the world's already vulnerable, especially indigenous people of the world. They are at the front lines of the consequences of the global warming. There are very interesting recommendations in this report. No new coal plants after 2021. In fact, I think those who follow this, there was a down-to-earth report on indigenous people, and they were telling most of these areas in India particularly, they are rich with these coal and oil minerals. And there have been coal blocks allotted to certain companies in some of these areas. So if world listens to this report that no new coal plants after 2021, I think that India has to follow that. And all the G20 countries must phase out existing coal by 2030, with all others following suit by 2040. So all the coal has to remain underground after 2040. No new mine leases, and all others have to be closed. And quadruple solar and wind capacity and triple renewable energy investments by 2030 to maintain a net zero trajectory by mid-century. This is very important because another movement is ongoing of the net zero. I would speak about it later. But first, about indigenous knowledge. UNESCO defines this indigenous knowledge. I think many of you must be knowing this is the local knowledge that is unique to a culture or society. Other names for it include local knowledge, folk knowledge, people's knowledge, traditional wisdom, or traditional science. This knowledge is passed from generation to generation, usually by word of mouth and cultural rituals, and has been the basis of agriculture, food preparation, health care, education, conservation, and the wide range of other activities that sustain societies in many parts of the world. So this is a very broad definition, but in fact, this collective knowledge, what we call as traditional, ecological knowledge, is made of indigenous knowledge plus indigenous science. All this combined together as a traditional ecological knowledge with collective knowledge of the land, sky, and sea. Indigenous people are excellent observers and interpreters of change in the environment. And this is what scientists also do. Based on their observation, they come to certain conclusions. Similarly, these observations, these very outstanding observations through centuries, from generation to generation. And I think how valuable they are. We cannot value them in terms of all modern efforts. And these are the traditional knowledge is also an answer to the most pressing global problems. In fact, this is the foundation of indigenous people's identities, cultural heritage, civilization, livelihood, and coping strategies over several centuries. And its promotion, protection, and preservation is fundamental for sustainability of livelihoods, resilience to disasters and climate change, manifold. If we talk about the instruments to maintain or conserve these knowledge systems, then we have the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's very, very important. And one of the articles says that each contracting party shall, as far as possible and as applicable, subject to national legislation, respect, preserve, and maintain knowledge, innovations, and practices of indigenous and local communities, embodying traditional lifestyle relevant for the conservation and sustainable use, both conservation and its use also, of biological diversity, and promote their wider application with the approval and involvement of the holders of such knowledge. One of the speakers spoke about the prior informed consent. So their involvement is important for the use of our application of these knowledge, innovations, and practices, and encourage the equitable sharing of benefits. That is most important. I think a lot of effort are being done by the countries to bring these equitable sharing of all the benefits which many companies for the use of biodiversity and traditional knowledge. That is where the benefit sharing, there are few legislation in the world that take care of this. Global challenge, in fact, as you can know, the indigenous people are the custodian of quarter of the world's surface area and safeguard 80% of the world's biodiversity. So they have major stake in conservation of biodiversity. They hold vital traditional knowledge and expertise to adapt, mitigate, and reduce climate and disaster risk. And during this COVID-19 pandemic, traditional knowledge and healers of indigenous people can provide information on disease prevention, traditional medicine, etc. This is, of course, being their help is being taken in many parts of the world. This is another, when we talk about the traditional knowledge, importance of languages is very important. That is why, of course, 2019 was the International Year of Indigenous Languages. And there, this was one of the proposals to declare a decade of indigenous languages, 2022 next year to 2032, to empower and, of course, conserve those languages. Many of those languages have been almost wiped out. They are extinct. And of course, this is one of the recommendations of this International Year of Languages and this Los Pinos Declaration, and which says the slogan is "Nothing for us without us." A very important slogan. And of course, this is another instrument, the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People 2007. And I think this is widely quoted because it sets guidelines, basic framework, how the indigenous, the human rights or the rights of indigenous people can be protected, respected, and of course, all the development planning should be done according to their needs and interests. Future we want, in fact, this is the precursor to, this was the Rio +20 declaration, the outcome document, which was named as Future We Want, and precursor to the SDGs and Agenda 2030. And this stands as very important. We stress the importance of the participation of indigenous peoples in the achievement of sustainable development. We also recognize the importance of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the context of global, regional, national, and subnational implementation of sustainable development strategies. And this resulted into all those SDGs. And of course, so drivers are universality, integration, and leave no one behind. And that covers everything, in fact, for the indigenous people. And these are some of the goals which implicit or explicit way, both ways, directly, indirectly, is related to indigenous people. Goal 1, indigenous people's rights to lands, territories, and resources. 2, concerning the agricultural productivity and income of indigenous small-scale farmers. 4, unequal access to education for indigenous children. 5, empowerment of indigenous women, gender equality. This is 10, overcoming discrimination and inequality for indigenous peoples. 13, 14, 15, this climate action, life below water, and life on land. And I think here, all these, the indigenous people's traditional knowledge is so important. Goal 16, indigenous people in time of conflict. And 17 is calls to indigenous peoples to engage actively in the implementation of SDGs. Follow up and review of the 2030 agenda at all levels to ensure that progress for indigenous people is reflected. That means, I think, when we talk about no one should be left out. So this is a very inclusive, because they are in a way, it's overarching over all the this SDGs. Climate justice is another area, and which is, I think, much talked about, and reaching the unreachable. In fact, when this subject came, last year, Unesco Jakarta organized a Sustainability Insight, and its director, Shahbaz Khan, interviewed me for half an hour. It was impromptu interview on the climate justice, and that gave a lot of, there was so much question answers by many these indigenous groups from all over the world, gave a lot of insight on this climate justice. And because this provides, when we talk about the climate action, the ethical, social, and cultural dimension that is missing, because even the IPCC report, which had just come, doesn't talk about these aspects, because these are basically the physical aspects or environmental aspects of the climate crisis. Climate justice is about reaching out to the unreached regions, people, and communities who are the most vulnerable to climate impacts. And there, these questions of ethical and social issues come. And in fact, recently, Greta Thunberg and many others, all those climate strikes, talks about climate justice, because children are another vulnerable group like indigenous community. And way back in 2002, there was this indigenous meet, which is called as on the climate justice, and which is called as Bali principle of climate justice. I just quote it: climate justice affirms the rights of communities dependent on natural resources for their livelihood and cultures to own and manage the same in a sustainable manner, and is opposed to the commodification of nature and its resources. That is what commercialization or the market forces are commodifying. The natural resources are those which are basically held by the knowledge, which are held by these traditional communities. So this is very important, the principle. Net zero climate target, I was talking about this, and this new report also, of course, Secretary General call, and on this year's Earth Day, we had with Climate Reality, we had this net zero in a way climate literacy webinar. And American president, new president, held an international meet, and also his envoys traveled to India, China, and many of those countries to declare net zero. But I think is that this net zero climate target takes care of the indigenous communities based on the equity principle, or the first principle that UN proposed was the common but differentiated responsibilities, and of course later on the capability was added. So all those, the polluters pay principle, common but differentiated responsibility, precautionary principles, these were the basis of climate justice. They have been now the net zero climate target. And this is what this new report by Oxfam warns, that net zero targets could lead to an explosion in demand for land, increasing hunger and land inequality, impacting indigenous communities. That is very important. The net zero has now shifted focus on carbon removal from emission reduction. And questionable interventions like biofuels, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, geoengineering, monoculture plantations, carbon offsets, and other techno-fixes have got a new lease of life since net zero's inception. And net zero should be a pathway to real and transformative climate action, and not greenwash. Carbon emissions need to be reduced now, and land-based climate solutions must center food-first approaches that help achieve both zero emissions and net zero hunger. So this is very important. Even the Forest Rights Act that India boasts to the world, that takes care of the rights of traditional, the scheduled tribes and other traditional forest dwellers, what we call as Adivasis. And that's also, if we promote the net zero climate targets, then of course possibility of more tribal land alienation, even when science tells us that there is simply not enough land, and no amount of tree plantation can net the amount of ever increasing GHG emissions that we keep dumping into the atmospheric. Already a lot of land in compensatory afforestation, tribal lands are being diverted to the plantations, and there are very little land that is going to be left. Another, the international domain which UNESCO promotes is the intangible cultural heritage, and these are the 5 domains, of course, the oral traditions, the expression, these are all UNESCO designates some of these intangible heritage, performing arts, social practices, rituals and festival events, knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe, traditional craftsmen. These are very important because these are, once they are declared as cultural heritage, they become the property of the whole universe because they possess outstanding universal value, and every country, every nation has to protect them. And nature, culture, this like cultural enterprises are what we call as creative economy. A lot of value when we talk about the decent jobs or the green jobs. This is one area which is, of course, very much neglected. And these are some of the figures. Creative economy is one of the fastest growing sectors in the world. And this is what the trade in this is. And nature-based traditional arts and crafts linked with cultural diversity in forms, example, performing arts, visual arts, design, architecture, form the creative diversity and innovation. And these are, of course, there are several benchmarks which tribal and indigenous communities have put forward in this globalized world. And another area I think you all must be knowing, nature-based solutions. And I think these are the custodian of these nature-based solutions are the indigenous people, and which is now being valued. And in the new nature deal, this is proposed by the WWF. It will be discussed during the COP, which is going to be held, Biodiversity COP, which is going to be held in October this year. And a lot of, when we talk about the green recovery program, this new deal is being discussed and very, very important. And nature for climate, because every country has to submit their nationally determined contributions post 2020. And I think once we take this into account, nature, obviously the native, these indigenous communities will have to figure it out. And the whole decade of ecosystem restoration. In fact, Jadhav Payeng, in what wonderful way he has done this ecosystem restoration in his area, and the Majuli, which is a beautiful cultural landscape. So this, I think these are some of the model examples that will serve the purpose. And this is one of the architectures that the Maori communities in New Zealand, in fact, they just, it's a combination of the traditional architecture, which we call a Eurocentric architecture, with the Maori values and approaches. And I think in our country also, some of these, like the earthen architecture, which Auroville in Pondicherry, which has been recognized by UNESCO, is kind of a hybrid between the traditional as well as modern architecture. And in Japan, they promote Satoyama and Satumi. The landscape approaches which are based on the traditional knowledge system. And a lot of crop plants, and particularly in tribals, these are some of from the Northeast India, many tribes they use. And of course, means shifting agriculture, as I said, of course, with the cycle, it's one area where, means if I have to speak, it will take hours together. Means this is one area, the traditional knowledge system of the shifting agriculture is so important. In 1 hectare of area, they grow how a mix of around a dozen species. And their mixing or their architectural pattern, I had studied how these preserve not only the ecological niche, but also restore the successional pattern of this the landscape. Very important landscape management practice. Of course, means if we remove some of the aberrations to this system. And of course, for the climate change, of course, some of the traditional architecture, there are like 118 million homes in India, 86 million are mud houses, 65 million. So a lot of these mud houses, nobody, of course, these are being abandoned now, but I think some way these need to be, is like the Maoris they are doing nowadays. They can be repurposed, reused, and of course retrofit to suit the current needs, and refrigeration. In fact, if we talk about, there are a lot of indigenous practices available. Center for Environment Education, I was involved in that. They had done a parampara, this where they just do have required. It's available on Ministry of Environment Forest website. A lot of indigenous and the traditional practices related to this. Then these are the traditional water wisdom. Many, I think you all know. I'm not going to go into all these details.
Yeah, sir. Yeah, please.
Here I would like to end. And thank you very much for, I think I have taken much of the time, but it was a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much for this enlightening presentation and the wisdom out there. Thank you so very much, sir. And with this, we have some questions also pouring in. And one of our dear friends, Mr. Subbarao, has raised his hand for the last half an hour. We are just giving him 2 minutes to please quickly speak as to what he wants to convey, sir. Very quickly.
I congratulate all the speakers for bringing out the issues related with indigenous people and the climate change. But what I was looking at, most of it was confined to the north and northeast regions. That's very good to understand, because that zone is highly sensitive. The most important issue which is missing today is the minor forest produce, which gives the maximum livelihood to the tribals, indigenous people. No serious studies have been conducted in the entire country by the forest departments. Today, both Telugu states have handed over the forest minor produce issue to Girijan Corporation. I am one of the State Wildlife Board advisors, and this is the status here in the Telugu state. I would like to bring it to the notice of all the speakers and Aditya in this regard. Nothing much and nothing more. Please look into this particular aspect of climate change and impact of minor forest produce production systems and their livelihoods. Thank you, sir.
Sure, sir. Sure. We'll keep an eye to that. And with this, some quick questions for the panelists. It's like for Archana, is there a forum or movement to mobilize the indigenous youth of India? Very quickly, Archana. Archana, you are there? I think Archana has some issues. Okay. Aditya ji, is Climate Reality India or any other organization working to highlight the plight of indigenous communities in India to facilitate climate justice?
Thank you, Bhavesh, for the question. With Climate Reality is working on it, and we are studying the cause. And just like this webinar is one of the things which we have brought out. Plus, now we are also conducting some more studies. As I said, we're traveling to the Himalayas. We are traveling also to the coastal places, and we are trying to figure out how this climate justice, what are the roles and rights, why, as Mr. Subbarao also pointed out, what are the issues which are burning issues which the communities are facing. And yes, we do plan to take them forward. We do plan to bring them on the website, plan to talk about them to the policymakers also, because Climate Reality works with nearly all the levels, whether it's a policy level or the grassroots level. We are working at both the levels. So we will be bringing it up, because this is going to be probably a defining issue for the coming times. Because as we are saying, as Dr. Saab very thankfully explained us about, I think today we had a master class on this from Dr. Rambhuj. So the way things are happening, the way the climate is moving forward, the way the rights of the indigenous people are being encroached upon. So yes, this will be the burning issue for the coming times, and Climate Reality would like to be a partner with indigenous people to bring out their things on not only on a national scale. We would like to even project it on the global scale. We would like to make it a part of the COP, so that the global community, because the injustice is not only happening at a very local level, the injustice is also happening at a very, very global level, where the West has consumed, they are not willing to come on board for a lot of issues. And ultimately the sufferers are what we are talking about, the people living in the South Asia region, people who are extremely poor, people who cannot even make their ends meet, living on one meal a day sometimes. So that type of a community is the one which is being today, which is actually standing in the harm's way. So we definitely want to raise this issue right at the highest level, at the COP level also.
Thank you so much, Aditya-ji. And I remember you people are working with the tribal schools in Odisha as well to amalgamate this knowledge base. So more power to you. I think our people would touch base with you very soon. Dr. Rambuj, does the Indian delegations to international climate negotiations like the UNFCCC include indigenous representatives?
Yes, definitely. In fact, every time, of course, I don't know about the Glasgow, which is going to happen this summer, or whether it is going to be the online or in person. But a lot of indigenous people, of course, officially this is the tragedy. Officially, they haven't taken any. They go on their own through other like international coalition of the indigenous people or some other NGO groups. But official delegations, they are mostly consist of the government officials, maybe some state officials, and mostly the MPs and others. Means, of course, it's a very strong delegation, close to some 30-40 people in these kind of negotiations they go. But I think this is a high time these people must be involved.
Okay, thank you so much. In fact, as Archana rightly mentioned, with the kind of things she has been doing, and our attendees have also been appreciative to that. So we think there is a positive momentum to that. Rituraj, how is the Environment Justice Forum shaping up, and what's the future plan for that?
Thank you, Bhavesh. Well, Environment Justice Forum, Indigenous Peoples Climate Justice Forum, rather, is something we had planned and executed very recently because we thought that there was a space that needed to be filled up, especially with communities from Northeast India. In fact, the entire Eastern Himalayan region, which is, I think, one of the early climate impacted, as well as with a very huge population of indigenous communities, whether it's West Bengal or Orissa or the entire Northeast. We have so many different ethnic groups and tribes, riparian communities, mountain communities, coastal communities, all of which are facing the threats which are in the, facing the brunt of the climate crisis. And not just now, the whole world is talking about floods that are coming, about erosion, about human conflicts and human wildlife conflicts. But in Assam, for example, we have seen that for decades. And I think it is also time for us to be recognized as the communities who can show the world what is resilience in the face of such impacts. Because there are many regions which are now newly facing floods, but here people have lived with floods for so long, right? So maybe we can showcase this resilience to the world. And at the same time, the third and most important part is that any conversation about climate justice, about where the climate funds, whenever they're made available to the early impacted regions and communities, these conversations must include the communities that have already faced the consequences for so long. So this Indigenous Peoples Climate Justice Forum is basically designed to ensure that there is a place for such conversations, for stories to come out, for showcasing to the entire world.
Thank you so much. More power to your efforts. And with this, time is also up. And I think we have been able to address some of the questions. Audience, let your questions pour in, though we don't have time as of now, but we'll answer them to your email IDs, to your links provided. Rest assured onto that part. Thank you so very much, panelists, for enlightening us, for sharing the knowledge, for sharing the work that has been done in this very domain of Indigenous people, the climate justice forums, and the way forward to some good, great extent. We are indebted to you. And thank you so very much, attendees, for standing with us throughout the program, for being a part of this initiative, for being a part of this change. We look forward to many more collaborations in times to come. Thank you so very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bhavesh. Very nicely conducted. Great. And Rituras, excellent. And overall, of course, Aditya is always on top.
Thank you, sir. I think we all enjoyed this discussion today, and I think we have to take it forward. And
Yes.
especially with you guiding us, I think we should be able to move ahead. So thank you very
Sure,
much.
sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone.
Okay, then
Bye-bye.
we close it now.